Hey everyone, before we get into today's stories, I really want you to go check out the new Chilling original movie over on the Chilling app. GALE, Stay Away from Oz. Long gone are the days of emerald cities and yellow brick roads. The enchanting tale of the Wizard of Oz is about to take a haunting turn. Dorothy Gale, who's now in her twilight years, bears the scars of a lifetime entangled with the paranormal forces of a mystical realm. These otherworldly encounters have left her shattered, and the echoes of her experiences now reverberate through her soul-living relative, Emily. As Emily is beckoned to confront the unresolved matters of this bone-chilling Oz, a terrifying journey awaits her. It's a horror spin and continuation of the Wizard of Oz story. It's only streaming on Chilling, and it begins on September 18th, 2023. Users can receive 50% off an annual subscription plan to the website with the promo code GALE2023. The promo code can only be entered on the website, not the apps. GALE is an exclusive original film and can only be watched by users with a subscription plan. So what are you waiting for? Go check it out. Here's the full-length trailer.
Just relax. Listen to the sounds, the tempo, and just picture yourself there, in your dreams. Can you see it? Talk, tick, talk, tick, talk. Are you there?
Yes.
Emily. Yes. Gale. You're Emily Gale.
Yes.
And you say you're a relation of Dorothy's?
I don't know. Maybe?
What you have there is a handwritten early draft of Dorothy's first book. Her writings were all based on her dreams of a place.
Oz?
I feel this is the best chance we have to unlocking all of this. To finding the truth.
The truth?
Yes, about Dorothy, the slippers.
Stay away from us! Stay away from us! Stay
Your
away
dreams.
from us!
They're the key to all of this.
Stay away from us! Stay away from us!
Where am I? Let's start at the beginning, and then you can learn for yourself.
Not too far behind me.
One final thing before we get into the stories. There are two stories in this episode that I feel I need to put a little bit of a warning out for, because there is some hints and there's some talk about abuse and sexual abuse towards minors. And I know there's going to be people that don't want to hear that type of thing. I myself am not a huge fan of it anymore now that I have kids as well. But just want to give anybody who doesn't want to listen to that a forewarning. That will be story number 3 and story number 6. There's timestamps in the description. If you feel the need and or want to skip those stories, go right ahead. No worries, no hard feelings. All right, here's the stories. My girlfriend at the time went camping 5 hours away from her home for her birthday and our anniversary. We made the trip after a big storm had passed through. We left town early and got there early in the afternoon. The guy at the entrance to the campground mentioned there was no one else staying there that weekend, so we're like, oh, this is going to be sick. First, we drove down these long pathways to our designated area. As you got close to it, the road narrowed. So basically, you had to back out to get out. We unloaded the car, got the tent set up, and decided to walk around the woods. It was dead silent, but it was still bright out, so we just took in the nature and walked a few miles away. We reached this point in the woods where there were some weird looking white cabins. They were all uniform, all built the same exact way. Like, I guess they were part of some camping grounds, but they seemed way, way out of the way. There's no sign of life either. It just felt eerie to be at, like we shouldn't be there. So we turned around and walked back. We took a breather in our tent, then tried to start a fire in the fire pit. Unfortunately, neither of us had ever been camping before and had no idea how to start a fire. We had brought some of those self-lighting logs from Walmart and some lighter fluid, but everything around us was soaked to the bone from the rain, and that had passed through the day before. We knew we needed kindling of some sort, but any dry sticks or leaves was far and few between. Eventually, we got a small fire going, ate some hot dogs and marshmallows, and just spent some time looking at the stars. Then we noticed just how dark it was out there. My girlfriend was easily spooked and was just like, "Hey, can we go back into the tent now?" So I put the fire out and we crawled back into the tent. We were talking to each other, but I could tell she was tense. Then suddenly, she put her hand over my mouth and was like, "Shh, you hear that?" Before I could respond, we both heard footsteps, like heavy footsteps. It sounded like a group of people walking. I just whispered to her, It's probably just animals or something." Then we heard mumbling, like low mumbling. We couldn't make out words, but it didn't sound like a sound that animals could make. It sounded like words, but hushed and non-elaborated. We sat there in silence, staring at one another in the dark for what felt like forever. The mumbling got louder, as did the footsteps, until it sounded like it was right outside of our tent. We both froze. I don't think either of us were breathing. And then, silence. We waited and waited and waited. I'm still not sure how much time passed, and eventually my girlfriend said, "We have to get back to the car." So with our adrenaline pumping, I peek out of the tent into the darkness and told her to stay behind me. Then we ran to the car. I locked the doors, and she was like, "What was that? We're not staying here. No one is out here but us. What was that?" I kept looking around for any signs of life, but we were still seemingly alone. I looked at her and was like, "Okay, I'm just gonna grab our stuff. You stay in the car." We only had our ice chest and our tent out, so I hopped out and ran, grabbed the chest, and then tossed it into the back seat. As I turned around to get the tent, I started hearing footsteps closing in again. In a moment of pure terror, I yanked the tent out of the ground, wrapped the tarp up in it, and slung it over my shoulder like some panicked Santa Claus, and then shoved it into the trunk as well. I didn't say anything when I got into the car except, "Do we have everything in here?" My girlfriend said yes, and I floored it. We came to a fork in the road that went like 6 different directions, and I asked my girlfriend if she remembered which path we came down just to get here, and she told me she didn't know. We chose a random one and ended up in a different camping spot. Cursing under my breath, I slammed it into reverse again. Thankfully, I noticed the angle we had exited from, and I could see the main path back to the gate. As we hightailed it out of there, I noticed there was a single small green light out into the woods to our right, near where our designated spot was. We drove the entire 5 hours back to our hometown and fell asleep on my girlfriend's parents' couch around 4 a.m. We never talked about that trip ever again, and I myself have had no desire to camp since. First, let me set up some background to make the flow of the story smoother. This happened almost 19 years ago. I was nearly 13 years old and being raised by my grandparents. We lived in this little tourist town in Florida. They had problems with their 2 daughters as adults, my mother being the older of the 2, and they wanted to do everything that they could to make sure that I didn't turn out the same way. A do-over, if you will. So needless to say, they were very, very strict. My aunt was having a good period. She had her stuff together. We were all very close. My aunt understood what it was like to be raised under a glass dome, metaphorically speaking. They raised her too, after all. So being as she was my only aunt, she made sure that the time we spent together was always super cool. I would stay over on Saturday nights. We would go out and hang out at the pier, and she would let me hang out with my middle school boyfriend, who would always find ways to get to wherever I was. My grandparents had no idea about any of these activities, of course. I was just spending some quality time with my aunt and giving them a break. It was nice that I had a young female figure since my mom wasn't around. So one night we were out having fun, and my aunt meets this guy and they really hit it off. He was actually very nice and introduced himself to me. He went by JR, and at first was a very kind and charming talker. They exchanged numbers after hanging out for a while. Then we both went to home and went to bed. They ended up going out a bit more, and my aunt really liked this guy. He took her to his house and introduced her to his father, showed her around his land. He lived out in the woods in the middle of nowhere. I've lived in this town for 30 years and still to this day couldn't tell you where exactly that is. I was only there once. He was teaching my aunt how to shoot a gun. I remember her shoulder rocking back and forth with the impact of the shot, and it surprising her. He had these weird flamingo dancing clothes in his closet. It was all just seemingly harmless, but everyone has their quirks. About 10 days, maybe 2 weeks later, we were out there again by the pier, out by the payphones just talking about what to do that night, maybe what to get for dinner. JR and my aunt were in their late 20s, early 30s, and as much as she loved me, I imagine there was times that I got in the way. So anyway, we were at the pier. He's talking about how he has all these painkillers. He offered me one. I declined, of course, and told him I had a high tolerance to pain anyway. I didn't need it. He then, with a huge smile, asks me if he can see for himself, assuring me he won't really hurt me. He's just trying to have fun. This guy twists my arm behind my back until I hear a pop. I start to cry and he laughs and says, "Aw, sweetheart, I was only playing. You said you had a high tolerance. I guess I'm stronger than I thought I was. I'm sorry. No need to ruin the good time we're all having." I end up going into the private pier office, which my granddad managed, still crying. My aunt comes in and lets me know that she thinks it's really messed up, and she talks to him about it. She goes back outside and he asks what she's up to that night. She tells him he isn't sure if I'm staying over because of what just happened. I was really wanting to go home. I was also pissed that she hadn't decked him right there for hurting me. He tells her that she should meet him under, let's call it the Sunset Bridge at 2 a.m. on the other side of town. He says that the stars are really beautiful and you can listen and hear the fish. He tells her he would love to see it with her, and they can dance under the moon. We're all from this fishing family and live in a fishing town, so fish activities under a bridge late at night wasn't necessarily something that threw up a red flag. If it's dark and late, there won't be people hogging up all the fish. She tells him maybe, and we leave. I decide to spend the night after all, later sneaking in only if she'll pick up my boyfriend Charlie. She calls him when she got home, and she says that she can come, but she's gonna have me with her. He groans and is like, "Fine, all right, I guess she can come. Maybe if she gets tired, she can just sleep in the car." About an hour after she called JR the first time, I ask her about Charlie and she agrees. She sits down with me, hugs me, touches my face lovingly, apologizing for what happened to my arm. My aunt was an amazing woman and I do love her very much. She calls JR again and tells him not to worry, she's going to pick up Charlie, so I'll have my own entertainment and they can have their own time. He immediately goes into this rage, starts sputtering and cussing about how it's too complicated now, and he just wanted an intimate meeting with her, not a damn family reunion. He went on and on about how he wouldn't want to have to babysit a 13-year-old kid and her 14-year-old boyfriend. He then hangs up. My aunt hangs up the phone and then tells me what happened, and we go about our night with pizza rolls and PlayStation, and everything seems fine. He calls her a few more times, drives by the house for a couple of weeks after, but my aunt was having none of it. After a while, he left our lives just as swiftly as he come in. The whole affair lasted only a month, if that. 3 weeks, maybe all in all. It really wasn't the crazy experience she's ever had, so it was soon forgotten, and we all went back to our own business. Fast forward 2 years later, I'm almost out of middle school. My aunt had moved to a city about 40 miles away. I'm still living with my grandparents. They were still strict, but as they'd gotten older, so had I. I knew a few ways around their rules. One day my friend Frank and I missed the bus home from school. I called our good high school friend Darla to come pick us up and take us home after riding around for a bit. She has this big, beautiful red truck, and I would ride around in the cab, loving the freedom of the wind. We were smoking cigarettes and laughing and listening to the radio. The time I would have spent on the bus before my stop was just enough time to hit up Taco Bell. We cruised down the road a little bit, heading back to Frank and I's separate houses. He lived just down the road. She dropped me off first. My grandparents came outside. They were heavily confused at the sight of an unknown vehicle, even more so when they saw that I gotten out of it. After letting her be the one to explain that she was older, cooler, and more responsible, my grandparents thanked her for being kind enough to take me home, and they said how lucky I was that she happened to be there just to help me get back. That was the last time we ever saw my friend. She didn't show up for work for 5 days, and I can't speak for everyone, but I just assumed that she'd run away. Darla's parents were going through a nasty divorce. The dad had a new girlfriend, and the mother was very bitter about it. Rightfully so, I guess. It was embarrassing for all the kids. Her truck wasn't left behind. I figured she got tired of her parents acting like infants and just took off. I missed her, but she was a whole other league of freedom and coolness. 16 is a whole different life than 14, especially when you're in different schools. I wished her, well, maybe even a little envious that she got out of this town and that I was still here. I hadn't heard anything for 2 weeks about her, when about 9 p.m. at night, my grandparents got a phone call to turn on the news. Darla's body was found out in the woods. She'd been strangled to death and just left out there. I don't even know for how long. I was completely devastated. I was so joyful that I had my last experience with her, but so saddened and horrified. She was so young, barely older than myself. She was about to be 17 in just a short time. This was a very sad time for our entire town. The good and bad news is they caught the guy who done it. He confessed after having some very incriminating evidence, and during his questioning also confessed to killing his girlfriend, who'd been missing for about 8 years, and also his father, staging his death to look like a suicide by hanging. When they showed his mugshot on the screen and said his name, I swear I almost passed out. There, clear as day on the screen, staring back at me was a picture of JR. I had no idea they even knew each other. I can't even imagine what would have happened if we'd gone under that bridge that night with him. Investigation Discovery Channel did a piece on it a couple of years back. I was shocked to see it on the TV. Those memories came rushing back, and I decided to write them all down. I literally have a newfound appreciation of life now that I'm old enough to understand just how close I could have come to being killed as well. My aunt lived on to make some new awesome memories with me. I have a beautiful life with my husband and my 3 boys, and all of this wouldn't have happened if things had gone differently that night. During the late afternoon of April 22 in 1974, 20-year-old Stanley Walker and his 18-year-old coworker Michelle Ansley were finishing up their shift at the HIFI shop in Ogden, Utah. Stanley was just about to lock up the door when 4 men walked inside. But before he had a chance to tell them the store was closed, one of the men pointed a gun at his face. He and Michelle were marched down into the store's basement by one of the robbers, who then bound their wrists and ankles to prevent them from raising the alarm. The 4 men then set about robbing the HIFI store, loading each piece of expensive audio equipment into one of the 2 waiting vans. Around 10 to 15 minutes later, 16-year-old Courtney Nesbitt walked into the store's open door in search of Stanley Walker. Stan had allowed him to park in the store's lot while he ran an errand, and Courtney wished to thank him for it. But instead of Stan, he came face to face with 4 armed robbers who dragged him into the basement and took him hostage as well. The robbers tried to finish the task as quickly as possible, but the presence of 3 hostages meant they needed to be guarded. and the job was taking longer than they expected. Passers-by were growing visibly suspicious, and their plan was falling apart. Just as the last few pieces of audio equipment were being loaded into the van, Stanley Walker's 43-year-old father walked into the HIFI shop. His appearance suddenly alarmed all 4 robbers, who were forced to take another stranger prisoner. But whilst he was being detained, yet another person showed up to the store. Much like Orrin Walker, Carol Nesbitt had arrived looking for her missing child. She was soon reunited with Courtney in the basement. It must have made for a terrifying reunion for the prisoners, but since their captors were quite clearly robbing the store, their lives would surely be spared if they remained silent and compliant. Once the robbers had gutted the store stockroom, 2 of them entered the basement to deal with the hostages. One of the men was carrying a bottle wrapped in brown paper bag, and after telling them it contained a mix of vodka and sleeping pills, he began to force feed it to the prisoners. Stanley Walker complied at first, wanting nothing more than to get through the ordeal alive. But it quickly became obvious that it wasn't vodka that he was being forced to drink. It was a highly corrosive chemical drain cleaner. Stanley screamed as his lips began to blister, his entire upper body burning as the fluid flowed through his stomach. Michelle Ainsley was next. She begged for her life, but was still forced to drink. The whole process continued, with each prisoner being force-fed drain cleaner before the robbers tied duct tape to their mouth. The goal was to dampen their screams of agony, but the pus that leaked from the blisters on their lips prevented the tape from sticking. Faced with 5 writhing bodies in front of him, each racked with unimaginable pain, one of the robbers produced a pistol and began to execute the captives. Carol and Courtney Nesbitt were shot first, both in the back of the head. Courtney somehow survived the wound. His mother, sadly, did not. Stan Walker was then fatally shot in the head, but the bullet aimed at his father merely grazed the back of his. Orrin was stunned, bleeding, but somehow conscious. He knew well enough to play dead, but what came next must have severely tested his will to survive. The only prisoner who hadn't been shot was 18-year-old Michelle Ainsley, yet it was no mercy. Her suffering had yet to conclude. She was then forced to strip before one of the robbers violated her brutally for around 30 minutes. When he was done, Michelle asked to use the bathroom. The robber watched as she did her business, then grabbed her by the hair and dragged her back into the basement and shot her in the back of the head. Orrin Walker, who was still playing dead at this point, later claimed her final words were a wail of, "I'm too young to die," before the gunshot rang out. No matter how hard Orrin tried to play dead, nothing could prevent him from flinching at the sound of Michelle's execution. One of the robbers then walked over to him, wrapped a wire around his neck, and began to strangle him. Orrin tried to fight for his life, but another of the robbers joined the fray, and they managed to pin him to the ground. A ballpoint pen was inserted into his ear, held steady, then stamped on. The pen tore through Orrin's eardrum, broke in 2, then punctured his throat. The robbers then left Orrin bleeding to death and escaped with their haul of HIFI systems. 3 hours later, Stanley Orrin's mother drove over to the store to look for her husband and her son. She was accompanied by Stan's brother, who broke down the basement door while she called 911. The scene that greeted him was something like out of a horror movie. The basement floor was a cocktail of coagulate. The dead lay still, and the dying groaned. As first responders began arriving at the scene, they were joined by a rabble of news-hungry TV journalists, and it wasn't long before the word of the slaughter flooded the airwaves. A few hours after the news broke, Ogden police received a tip from a serving member of the United States Air Force. The anonymous airman informed one of them that his comrades had recently remarked, "One of these days I'm going to rob that hi-fi shop, and if anyone gets in the way, I'm going to kill them." Around the same time the cops received their anonymous tip, 2 teenage boys were dumpster diving near Hill Air Force Base, just a few miles south of the Ogden crime scene. As they ransacked the dumpster for anything of value to them, They pulled out a small bag containing several wallets and purses. Upon a closer inspection, they were horrified to discover that each belonged to a victim of the Ogden HIFI murders, having recognized their pictures from their driver's license. When he learned the evidence was found in the Air Force dumpsters, an Ogden homicide detective drove over to the base to address the airmen. He made a show of parading each piece of evidence before the assembly, while another detective carefully observed their reaction. Most of the airmen stood in somber silence, horrified by the detective's grim retelling of the cruel and needless slaughter. Yet two of them began to display some very suspicious behavior. These two men were identified as 21-year-old Dale Selby Pierre and 19-year-old William Andrews. Pierre had moved to Brooklyn from his native Trinidad at the age of 17 and had enlisted in the Air Force in September of 1973. At the time of the HIFI murders, Pierre was out on bail for car theft and was the prime suspect in the murder as an Air Force sergeant. Upon securing a hasty search warrant for the two men's barracks, police found flyers for the HIFI shop along with a rental contract for a unit at a public storage facility. The detectives then tracked down the storage unit, cracked it open. They were greeted by the sight of the stolen HIFI equipment and a half-empty bottle of Drano. With a collection of evidence in tow, Pierre, Andrews, and a third man named Keith Leon Roberts were charged with first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. Their joint trial began on October 15th of 1974. In the following month, Pierre and Andrews were convicted of all charges and sentenced to death, while Roberts received just 5 years for robbery. It emerged that an integral part of the Pierre and Andrews plan involved murdering anyone they encountered during the robbery, and they'd researched ways to kill quietly and quickly using poisons, gases, and/or narcotics. The inspiration to use Drano had apparently come from the 1973 Clint Eastwood movie, Magnum Force, in which a prostitute drops dead after being forced to drink drain cleaner. At the trial, Orrin Walker's testimony shook all of those who heard it to their core. He called Pierre a sadist and said he deserved to die young after saying, after he shot Mrs. Nesbitt first, then he was kind of prancing around and walking in a manner that I got the impression that he was kind of enjoying what he was doing. This has been hard for me. It's hard for me to believe that I was ever involved in this. My son Stanley's life was taken with 2 shots in Drano. He tried 5 different times to kill me. Each one would have been lethal. It's all certainly changed our lives. Walker said that his younger son, traumatized by his older brother's murder, slept on a mattress in his parents' bedroom and refused to go to the basement of the house. Most of my wife's time is spent in bed, trying to forget. While in prison, Dale Selby Pierre changed his name to a grand total of 27 times, supposedly trying to protect his family from any backlash. After being denied, he was executed by lethal injection on August 28th of 1987, at the age of 34. He declined a last meal, with his last words reportedly being, "I'll be glad when this is over." 37-year-old William Andrews was executed on July 30th of 1992 after spending almost 2 decades on death row. His last meal was a banana split, which he shared with his niece and sister. Keith Roberts was discovered to have no knowledge of the murders, believing that he was simply a getaway driver. He was paroled on May 12th of 1987 after spending almost 13 years inside, and moved back to Chandler, Oklahoma to live with relatives. Then, barely a week after William Andrews was executed, Roberts placed the barrel of a gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Stan Walker, Carol Nesbitt, and Michelle Ainsley all lost their lives during the HIFI murders. Courtney Nesbitt was hospitalized for 266 days, and although doctors put his chances somewhere between slim and none, he managed to survive the whole ordeal, albeit with irreparable brain damage. Orrin Walker survived with extensive burns to his mouth and chin, as well as the damage to his ear caused by that pin. The HIFI murders remain so notorious that to this day, FBI trainees at Quantico Academy are taught all about them. They remain a classic example of how poorly planned and poorly executed crimes have a capacity to escalate, especially when a cold-blooded psychopath like Dale Selby Pierre has his finger on the trigger. America Online was a big thing when I was 13, or in other words, for my generation, AIM, which stood for, you guessed it, AOL Instant Messenger. It was around 2002. I would have been 13 and in 8th grade. I had many times went into chat rooms by myself or with friends just goofing around. Unfortunately, unsolicited photos were a thing then too, but usually you could stay clear of it by the chat room that you entered. I didn't have any photos of myself, and back when you had to take a digital photo and upload it from your camera. Plus, again, I was 13 and very self-conscious, which I'm sure anyone can relate to. But one day, a guy popped up on my screen wanting to chat with me. It went fine at first. I was very naive back then, and we quickly fell into a pattern of just talking. His name was Dave and lived in California. Eventually, he started telling me he loved me and all this, but the problem was that he was 19. Now, I wasn't proud of this at first, but being 13, I sent pictures of some random girl and told him it was me. He instantly fell for me, telling me age is just a number and how mature I was. Now, at this point, he didn't live in state, so there was never any chance of meeting up. Eventually, he told me his mom and him were moving to the city that was about a half an hour away from me. He started begging me to come see him and to go to a movie, anything. I had to break the catfish truth to him and tell him that those pictures were not of me, but of someone else. He was furious. He had been looking forward to a different type of child this whole time. He ended up forgiving me a few days later, saying, "I still want to meet you because I love you." All the things you say to a young girl to get to swoon her. I think back now and I'm like, wow, I was only 13. So I told my best friend everything. I just wanted her to go with me to meet this guy. The whole plan was him to drive to see me and then go to the movies to finally meet what I thought was the love of my life. I definitely had been brainwashed into believing that this was all very normal. I didn't tell my mom, of course, and honestly, she didn't notice anything was going on to begin with. So the day my friend and I were going to go meet up with Dave, her mom came and picked us up from school. And then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said, "Chrissy, you're not going to the movies. You're not going to meet that man. You are going to get seriously hurt or kidnapped. I cannot allow you guys to go." I cried and cried because I honestly thought I could handle everything and be just fine. And then she actually told me she wasn't going to say anything to my mom. We just weren't going. I just had to promise to never speak to him again. And never. He ended up showing up and was super upset that I didn't show up myself. He went off the handle on AIM. It scared me. It scared me how close I was to this man or even being near him. I never ended up talking to Dave again, but I easily believe I would have been kidnapped or worse that day if my best friend's mom hadn't stepped in. My mom would have been none the wiser, and I none the wiser either. But here I am today, thankfully, and learned a dire lesson. The year was 1995, and I was 16 years old. I lived in a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in a middle-class suburban community with my mother and 2 younger brothers. And of course, our 140-pound Doberman, Turbo. From the front door of our house, this is relevant, you can see directly into our living room, which had an open concept floor plan, with a kitchen and dining room. Our couch was on the wall directly in front of the front door. It was the summer between my sophomore and junior year in high school. My brothers and I had spent a decent amount of time outdoors because this was back when people still did that. I suppose anyone paying attention knew who lived in our house. And I also suppose they knew that the only adult was gone when the only car was gone. However, prior to the man showing up at the house, I never noticed anything off, and I never noticed anything afterward. So maybe we're just a random target. It was a Saturday, and my mom and the boys had run to the grocery store. In Nevada in the 90s, almost no one had air conditioning, so to cool off, you open up all the windows and doors and use fans. On this particular day, I had the back sliding door open and the front door wide open to get a cross breeze. Neither screen door was locked. I was napping on the couch in full view of the front door in shorts and a tank top. With unlocked doors, it's good we gain intelligence with age. In my defense, there was 140 pounds of protection on the floor right next to me, and probably, only for that reason, I'm alive to tell you this. Around the approximate time I expected my family home from the store, Turbo began barking. Assuming he was barking at their arrival, I told him to shush and try to go back to sleep. Turbo, God bless his sweet protective soul, continued to bark, becoming more and more intense and even aggressive with his barking. Finally, after 5 to 10 minutes or so, Turbo refused to go quiet, and my family never coming in from the car, I sat up, realizing that something was wrong. A man who I didn't know stood seemingly frozen, staring at my frenzied and barking Doberman. Assuming that the man had some appropriate business at my home, I hurried to the 10 steps to the unlocked screen door, constantly shushing Turbo. I apologized for my dog and for not hearing his knock. He never knocked. The man explained that he was from the phone company. He was here to check our lines. This entire time, he never took his eyes off Turbo, and Turbo never stopped snarling. I leaned forward far enough to see the street. Only unmarked, privately owned cars lined it. I looked at the man, who was dressed in tennis shoes, jeans, and a t-shirt. I was 16 and dumb enough to nap in front of an unlocked door, but I was no fool. Phone company personnel, A, always wear some kind of uniform, B, drive some kind of company vehicle, and C, don't come without being called, and D, don't work on weekends. I looked at the man, who had yet to look up from my 140-pound dog that was now foaming at the mouth. I grasped the screen door handle and held it. This got his attention. He met my eyes as I said, "You have 30 seconds to show me some kind of identification, or I'm opening this door." I don't even think he made an incoherent excuse as he ran away. I fell to my knees and hugged Turbo. Then I gave him all the meat in the fridge. I believe with absolute certainty that I would have been attacked if we hadn't had him. I'd like to think that if I hadn't had a huge, overly protective dog, I would be in the habit of locking doors, but what would be a screen door latch do against an intruder? And that creep stood there and watched me for 5 to 10 minutes. Perhaps, maybe he was paralyzed in fear, but maybe he was working his angles, and only Turbo's insistent display of willingness to kill anyone who threatened me changed his mind. That's just my theory. Turbo has long passed, but his legacy lives on, and 2 loving, loyal, and lethal, when necessary, dogs sleep with me still every single night. On the afternoon of June 1st, 1984, 7-year-old Mark Tildesley rode his bike down to his local candy store in his small hometown of Wokingham, England. The store's proprietor, Margaret Hickman, was very familiar with the boy, as he often spent his small weekly allowances there. Every time Mark visited, he would pay with 3 10-pence pieces given to him by his parents. But on the afternoon of June 1st, he paid with a single 50-pence coin. Margaret thought this was unusual, yet simply assumed that Mark's allowance had been raised and sold him his candy. A few hours later, at around 5:30 p.m., Mark once again set off from his home on his prized Riley Tomahawk. He told his parents he was headed for the Frank Ayers Fun Fair, which visited Wokingham 3 to 4 times a year. Mark promised to be home by 7:30 that evening, calling out, "Don't worry, Mom, I won't be late," as he pedaled out of the driveway onto the lane outside. But when 7:30 came and went, and Mark failed to return, his parents began to worry. At around 8 p.m., Mark's parents drove over to the fun fair to look for him. His bicycle was chained to the railings outside the entrance to the fairground, confirming that he'd been there. But inside, Mark was nowhere to be seen. His parents spent the better part of an hour searching that fairground, going stall to stall, calling out his name, but to no avail. Finally, just before 10 p.m. that night, Mark's parents contacted law enforcement to report him missing. Their eldest daughter and her husband were joined by numerous friends and neighbors for an overnight search party. But sadly, Mark could not be located. The following morning, Thames Valley Police put together a full search and rescue team and began to scour the area surrounding the fairground. While ground teams employed more primitive methods, a dedicated search and rescue helicopter utilized cutting-edge heat-seeking cameras to scan the nearby woods and parkland. But again, no trace of Mark could be found. The following weekend, over 100 Royal Engineers joined the search effort, bringing up police officers to question everyone present at the fun fair on the day in question. The search carried on for another week, but by the end of it, law enforcement was forced to admit that they had no idea how Mark had disappeared. To force a break in the case, a national appeal was launched shortly before the one-year anniversary of Mark's disappearance. The nationally syndicated TV show Crime Watch agreed to platform Mark's case, with their reconstruction watched by hundreds of thousands in June of 1985. The appeal generated several false leads, yet one caller's tip included a description which police found chillingly familiar. The caller described an elder with a crooked back who was dragging a boy fitting Mark's description away from the playground. In her statement, she referred to the individual as a stooping man, and when one high-ranking detective learned of this, he made an astute but horrifying connection. The detective spoke of a man named Sidney Cook, who had been suspected of using drugs to facilitate the molestation of young boys. However, due to his suspected crimes having very little evidence or reliable witnesses, no formal charges had ever been brought against him. The fact that Cook lived just an hour's drive away made him an obvious suspect, but this wasn't what drew detectives' suspicions. Their suspect had been nicknamed the Stooping Man, and given that he'd begun to suffer back problems as he entered his late 50s, Sidney Cook walked with a stoop. For political reasons, the investigation into Mark's disappearance dragged on for years and years. The case was hideously understaffed due to budget cuts and national strike action, with key officers needing to be diverted elsewhere. This meant that Mark's case wasn't revisited until the winter of 1989, by which time Sidney Cook was serving a 15-year sentence for manslaughter of a 14-year-old Jason Swift. Swift had been lured into Cook's apartment in the London borough of Hackney, under the pretense of there being a party. There, a group of men drugged, molested, and eventually suffocated the boy in what amounted to a harrowingly venal act of group violation. Since Cook didn't intend for his victim to die, he received a lesser sentence of manslaughter, but the presiding judge ensured the maximum prison sentence was given, on the account of his unspeakable depravity. For all intent and purpose, Cook was right where the cops wanted him. The only trouble was, he stonewalled every officer who attempted to question him, at least until the winter of '89, when he was officially linked to the murder of Mark Tittlesley. In mid-November of 1989, London's Metropolitan Police launched Operation Orchid. Their objective was to close several missing persons cases involving young children, Mark being one of them. During the course of their investigation, detectives questioned 36-year-old convicted pedophile Les Bailey. Bailey was considered an accomplice of Sidney Cook's and had been present at the death of young Jason Swift. Therefore, it stood to reason that if the stooping man had taken Mark, then Bailey either knew about it or was personally involved. Detectives subjected him to periods of heavy interrogation, alternating between offers of reduced or extended prison time. They appealed to his deepest fears, to his conscience, using every interrogation trick in the book, and in the end, Bailey cracked. He gave the detectives a small folded-up piece of paper, claiming that it had been in a cell for quite some time. When the detectives unfolded it, they discovered that it was a map of which showed the location of Mark's murder. The detectives recommended that Bailey tell them everything that he knew about Mark's fate. as possession of the map already implicated him in a very serious crime. And with that, the truth came spilling out. Bailey confessed to being a member of a large underground pedophile ring, who nicknamed themselves the Dirty Dozen. It was them who had abducted and murdered Mark back in May of 1984. Sidney Cook had been the linchpin of the despicable scheme. It was him that gave Mark that 50-pence piece on that day he disappeared. During the exchange, Cook invited Mark to join him at the Frank Ayers Fun Fair that evening and promised to pay for him to ride the Dodgem cars. But when Mark arrived, Cook had other plans in mind. Bailey recalled how Cook had invited him to a party before instructing him to drive from Hackney to Wokingham with a mutual friend named Lenny Smith. Upon their arrival at a secluded parking lot picked out by Cook, he appeared from some nearby bushes, dragging little Mark behind him. Mark kicked and screamed as he was forced into the back of the car, but was easily overpowered by Cook and his friends. When the group arrived at Cook's caravan, they found a man already waiting for them, an individual named ODDBOD. ODDBOD is obviously not the man's real name, rather a nickname given to him by his cousin, Sidney Cook. He was an active participant in the horror that followed Mark's arrival at that caravan, but didn't do a single day in prison for those crimes. You see, ODDBOD was later deemed to have the mental age of an 8-year-old, and under British law, such a mental deficiency means a person cannot be held responsible for their own actions. This meant that not only did the prosecution opt to not bring charges against him, but his identity was kept a closely guarded secret. Once Mark was out of the car and inside the caravan, the men set about trying to calm him down. Sidney gave the boy a glass of milk, but after a few sips, Mark handed it back while complaining that it tasted funny. Minutes later, the boy was slipping into unconsciousness, a result of the heavy dose of muscle relaxants Cook had slipped into the milk. After that, the abuse began in earnest. 7-year-old Mark Tittlesley was essentially violated until he died, with a coroner who examined his body, estimating that he'd been dead for at least 30 minutes before the abuse concluded. Les Bailey claimed to have suspected that something was wrong, as he knew firsthand that children dosed with muscle relaxants weren't supposed to stay unconscious for that long. However, Cook assured him that Mark was fine. He'd be returned to the fun fair with no memory of the evening's events. But Bailey knew he was dead. And so did Smith. On October 18th of 1991, Les Bailey was officially charged with the murder of Mark. His trial was one of the most judicially unusual in British history, for two main reasons. Firstly, and for reasons I'll come to explain, Sidney Cook was not charged with Mark's murder, despite being publicly named as Bailey's accomplice. And secondly, Les Bailey instructed his defense barrister to seek the maximum sentence possible, as opposed to the lesser one. He refused to say why he wished to be given more prison time, only that he was surprised and disappointed that Sidney Cook wasn't being charged. The following year, Bailey pled guilty to manslaughter, but was given 2 life sentences, way above the usual maximum of 10 years. When reached for comment, Mark Tittlesley's mother, Lavinia, expressed a deep disappointment in the verdict, adding that they should all hang. Just as law enforcement had their first suspected Sidney Cook, he refused to answer any of their questions regarding Mark Tittlesley's death, although a key ring identical to one Mark owned was found in his car in late 1985. No formal charges were brought against him. It was the view of Britain's Crown Prosecution Service that Les Bailey's confession was simply not enough evidence to properly secure a conviction. And since Cook was already in prison for manslaughter of Jason Swift, they had ample time to let the evidence stack up. Since then, Cook has dropped hints that he knows the location of Mark's body, but refuses to tell the police or the boy's family, most likely to rob them of any tangible closure. On October 7th of 1993, Les Bailey was murdered by 2 of his fellow inmates at Wandsworth Prison in southwest London. One man distracted him while the other crept up behind him with a piece of cord. He died in agony, and it's believed that he was targeted due to his involvement in Mark's death. Lavinia and John Tittlesley openly celebrated his murder, with the latter giving a harrowing statement to the journalist of national newspaper. "I've heard whispers that other prisoners didn't like him because of the awful crime he committed. and I think he got his just deserves. People hated him for murdering my son, and I found out who'd strangled him. If I could, I'd shake his hand. Lenny Smith also denied any role in Mark's murder and avoided prosecution on the same grounds as Sidney Cook. But in 2006, it was announced that he passed away after a painful and protracted battle with AIDS. Mark's parents once again celebrated the news, saying they only wish it happened sooner. ODDBOD, on the other hand, his fate remains a mystery. There's a chance he was taken into the care of the state and spent the remainder of his life under the watchful supervision of various psychiatric nurses. But only a select few have any idea where that might be. In 2019, Mark's parents reached out to Sidney Cook one last time and begged him to reveal the location of their son's body. Once again, he refused. Cook was 92 at the time and is still alive in prison at the time of writing. His death is imminent, and most likely, he'll take the secret of Mark's final resting place to his own grave. It constitutes a gutless final attempt by Sidney Cook to claim ownership over Mark, a final insult to his heartbroken parents, and an indicator of what a monster he truly is. I've told this story to several friends, family, and even coworkers, partly to tell a weird experience that I had in the forest, and partly to see if I could get some insight into what I actually experienced that night. I'm also interested in hearing from people reading this, what they might think had actually happened. I even have photos of the area, and I'm hoping to attach them to the post. I'm originally from northwestern Ontario and have been in and out in the forest my entire life. I grew up hunting, fishing, camping, and have gone on many remote backpacking canoe trips. I've also worked in the forest for a few different jobs. I've always felt very comfortable in the forest, and have never had even one bad experience until now. And that was until working in the forest near New Liskeard, Ontario. I was working in the district of the North Bay. As an ecologist, I've had many different jobs that brought me to every end of the district. One of those jobs involved conducting inventory on old logging cut blocks. This is something that I've done multiple times over in multiple different summers in different areas of that province. This particular block was located west of New Liskeard, about a 45-minute drive out of town. The area was very rural, with farm fields and the odd farmhouse scattered throughout. While driving the roads, it was common for other vehicles to stop and just stare at you. This might be because we were driving in a marked truck, or that we were the only people that locals didn't recognize. The block we were looking for hadn't been cut since 1995 and was located down this old, rarely used logging road. The two of us were tasked with collecting data on the block. To get to that block, we had to turn off on this overgrown road that barely even fit a truck on. The road had many pits that nearly sunk our truck at multiple locations. When we couldn't drive any further, we had to walk the rest of the way to the block, which took around a half an hour. The work started the same day as any other. While we worked, we talked about office drama, funny experience we've had, and what good movies we'd watched recently. As we got further into the block, I started to feel my chest get tighter. As we continued, I started feeling like we were being watched through the trees. These feelings got stronger the further we traveled onto that logging block. I tried to shrug them off, until my coworker suddenly stopped, reciting the data we were collecting, then looked at me and said, "I have a terrible feeling about this place." We then discovered that we both had been feeling like we were being watched, and that something wasn't right about this area of the forest. We continued with the work, and unsettling feelings persisted. As we continued further into the cut block, keeping our conversation, we suddenly stopped dead in our tracks, dropping the last word that was uttered. We both heard what sounded like two people having a conversation. This we couldn't comprehend because we were in a remote area. Deep down, this was almost undrivable trail on which we saw no sign of anybody else. Then another hour walk into the bush to get to the location. The forest was too thick to be any use recreationally, and it was not hunting season. What was also troubling was we couldn't make out what was being said. The voices would continue for a few seconds, then disappear as quickly as they started. Once they stopped, we would continue our work, but be stopped in our tracks as soon as the voices would pick up a few minutes later. This pattern continued until we came across trees that had been bent over and snapped. Now, it's not uncommon to find trees bent or snapped from bears or moose or even the weather. But what was odd about these trees was the proximity to the other trees. We would find a tight cluster of trees with the middle tree snapped and the others untouched. The trees were also free of any rub marks or scarring. Then, we came across a patch of young poplar trees that was completely surrounded by an almost perfect circle of dense spruce and pine trees. Within the patch, almost all the poplar trees had been snapped and bent down in different directions, but the surrounding evergreens were untouched. Neither of us had ever seen anything like this before, and with the feeling that something was watching us, we quickly got out of that area. As we moved back out of the block, the voices stopped, and the feeling of dread and being watched drifted away. We both expressed that it felt normal again, when we were only a half an hour walk away from what we had just experienced. I've shown different foresters the photos looking for an explanation, but never received a clear answer. The best I received was, maybe the soil composition is different in that location. But all expressed how they never had seen trees broken like that. I've asked First Nation individuals from different communities and been told by multiple people that what I experienced was a bad omen that shouldn't be talked about. Now that I type it out, I'm starting to have second thoughts about whether this is a good idea or not. What made me decide to post this was partly seeing other weird experiences in the forest, but also learning that 2 women had disappeared in that area. Julie Diane Fortier lived in Elk Lake, Ontario, went missing in 1980 after taking the bus to school. 5 years to the day, she disappeared. Her school bag, running shoes, and coat were found near the Haileybury, Ontario landfill. The landfill is located roughly 6 kilometers away where she was supposed to be attending school, and roughly 50 kilometers away from Elk Lake. Another 5 years pass before her remains are found by a couple along a dirt road outside of Haileybury. Many speculate on what happened to her, but the mystery itself was never solved. Melanie Ethier was missing from Newliscard in 1996 when she went on a walk from home to her friend's house. She was observed walking by multiple people on this walk home and seen crossing the Armstrong Street Bridge near her home. The last stretch of her journey involved a poorly lit back road where she disappeared without a trace. To this day, Melanie's whereabouts are completely unknown. I'm open to ideas on what I experienced in the forest of northern Ontario. My job continues to involve me slogging through remote areas of Canada. To this day, I have never felt the way I did in the forest near Newliscard, Ontario. I just got off work. Today, I work 7 a.m. to 1 p.m. Around 10:45, a man walked in. I've previously had odd encounters with this guy, such as seeing him walk by me around my neighborhood and him hanging out near my street. I brushed those off since I live right next to where I work. Figured he lived close by as well, but always just kept my eye on him. So anyway, the man comes in, orders his usual pastry, and tells me, "I'm gonna stay inside and eat this." For anyone who doesn't know, my country is currently under lockdown because of the coronavirus, and all dining indoors is strictly prohibited. Not to mention my bakery is tiny, and there's never been any tables to sit inside, only a coffee bar that has never had space to sit. So I tell him, "Hey, we're on lockdown. You can't really eat inside." His response chills me. "Are you alone here?" "Yes," I stupidly respond, but quickly try to catch myself. but my coworker will be here soon. A complete lie. It's only about 11 a.m. and my coworker isn't scheduled to be here until 1 p.m. when I'm off. Then no one will see me in here, he responds, and then goes back to eating his pastry at the coffee counter. I roll my eyes and just go back to work. I'm not getting paid enough to care if he quickly eats his pastry and leaves. 10 minutes pass, then 15. This guy is still inside. I look over. He's finished his pastry and is now moved closer to the open space in the counter that's meant for employees to walk back and forth between the front of the store and to the employees only side. Now I'm starting to get uncomfortable. I quickly text my coworker, a 30-year-old man who owns a lot of guns and treats me like his sister. I text him 911. I look over again, and now the man is even closer and is now, quote-unquote, reading a book. He's put the book in front of his face and is peeking at me from above it, watching. Multiple customers come in during his stay. Every time I turn my back to him, he gets closer and closer and closer, until eventually he is halfway in our employee-only area. I begin frantically texting my coworker. He tells me he's 4 minutes away. I finally make the decision to text my boyfriend as well. I had avoided doing so to keep from scaring him until now because I was terrified. I sat in the back of the employee area watching this guy, and I held a knife just in case he decided to come any closer. Just as he takes a step closer, my coworker bursts through the door. A confrontation ensues, and the man leaves the shop but continues to sit in his parked car right out front and staring at me still. I tell my coworker about the previous experience, and he's had enough. He marches out to the guy's car and tells him next time he comes around will be his last. My boyfriend pulls up at this point and joins in with the warnings. So Matthew, aka my stalker, let's not meet ever again. Hey everyone, thanks for listening if you stuck around to this point. If you haven't yet, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and that notification bell to be notified when future episodes come out. If you have a true scary story of your own, feel free to send it to my email or post it to my subreddit. You can stalk me on Twitter, you can stalk me on Facebook, and you can also stalk me on Instagram. All these links are below. What's going on, everybody? Wow. I hope you're having a great Thursday. Go listen to the new Blink-182 single that just came out. I already know I'm about to. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And I hope you also go check out that new Chilling original movie over on the Chilling app if you haven't yet. Definitely go check that out. My plan is to actually have another episode out for you later on this week, most likely Sunday night. So and that's going to be another really good one that I'm excited for. It's definitely geared towards things that really terrify me the most and horror stories that have happened to people while doing so. So look on the lookout for that on Sunday night. Back to the regular schedule next week, Monday night live stream for the next episode, and then another episode drop on Tuesday as well. Outside of that, I can't really think of too many other things. If you want to hear me rant and ramble, come to the live streams. Not going to do that anymore in these outros. I really love y'all, and especially the ones who drop very positive and awesome comments in this section, in the comment section below, and as well as in the live streams and just everywhere else, man. I appreciate every single one of you. I really, truly, honestly do. This is awesome. I can't believe that almost 2 years later, I'm where I'm at and still growing every day. So again, I love y'all. I appreciate the support from the haters and the lovers alike. Yeah, I'll see you guys on Sunday for the next episode, and then I'll see you Monday night if you want to join in on the live stream. All right, see y'all later. Cheers.